Welcome back. My name is Erik Fadiman, and this is Web Design Bootcamp. This is intended for you to make the leap to web design, whether you're just getting started or perhaps you're someone with years of print experience. Either way, you're probably starting to realize the handwriting on the wall that if you don't have web design skills, you're probably not going to be getting much work. So we are going to go from very basic to very advanced, cutting a swath down the middle in a short amount of time. This by no means is going to encompass everything you need to know in 4 weeks, but this will give you a really big overview of what you need to know and what you need to do to continue learning to start making web pages. Now you will hear me using a lot of different terms which might not be familiar to you, and you might think, he's going over that really quickly. Where can I do some further reading? Well, I've got a few resources bookmarked here that I'd like you to take a look at. As many of you already know, if you're a returning viewer, I teach at Seattle Central Community College, and I teach the web design classes there. If you go to my website, erikfadiman.com/SCCC, you can see that on the right-hand side here, I have a whole bunch of links to what I think are helpful articles. So if you hear me talk about accessibility and usability and web standards and semantic markup and search engine optimization, I can't possibly go into these in depth enough. I'm giving an overview in 4 weeks, but if you want to read more, you find these resources here. And while we're on the subject of WordPress, I want you to know that I will be offering a WordPress class soon, and I thought, you know, anybody can install a WordPress theme, but I really can't do blogging unless I build the blog by myself. So my summer project was I built this blog by hand with WordPress 3.0. You can't hear me? Is that what you're trying to say? Speak up. Is that better? How's my audio? I'll just keep going.
Yeah, just you can talk at a normal level. I'll adjust it on
talk at a normal level?
Yep.
David, is that what you're getting from the world out there?
That's what I'm getting from the world, yeah.
I'll try to project just a little bit more.
Great.
So yeah, so I taught myself WordPress this summer. I had a great time, and I was inspired by one of my students. So if anybody's out there, punch Andrew Niedermeyer in the arm for me. Andrew Niedermeyer basically had us post on his blog where he made something new every day. So I'm going to do the same thing, and here I am with an audience of hundreds across the world. I'm going to post something new to my blog every day for the month of September. So now I have to do it. See, I got a bit of a warm-up here. That'll sort of help me. There's no point in having a blog and learning WordPress if you're not going to use it every day. So go ahead and check it out, erikfadiman.com/blog. If you want to see me try to do something creative every day, I think it's going to be a great exercise. I'd encourage lots of other people to start blogging and doing it as well if you feel you need a little creative shot in the arm. So what are we building today? Not that one. There we go. A web page. Looks pretty exciting, right? This is an HTML document. This is what it's going to look like when we get started. We're going to move to that, and then we're going to move to that. I know it doesn't look like a design solution, but I'm doing this in a different order. Oh, and you'll find these at erikfadiman.com/bootcamp. So you can sort of, here's the one where we're going to start with. You're going to see the site grow. So bookmark this URL over the course of the next 4 weeks, erikfadiman.com/bootcamp. You'll see it develop over the next 4 weeks. So why does it not look like a website yet? Why does it look like a bunch of ugly colored boxes? If you remember my last class, we called that Photoshop to HTML. I'm trying a very different and perhaps even radical approach here. This is probably going to be antithetical to a lot of designers. Just throw away Photoshop, or don't even open up Photoshop. In this class, let's talk about how we need to build a web page first and add a design solution to that after the fact, which is why there's no Photoshop exercise file. Did we get exercise files up, Sarah?
Yes.
Okay.
For people who have purchased the course.
For people who have purchased the course, yes. Thank you for clarifying that. And did we get the cheat sheet up? CSS cheat sheet?
Yes.
Excellent. Okay, because I'll be referencing that later. I guess that's only for people who purchased the course as well, huh? You got something in your back? High technology. You think they could have made that smaller by now?
I know. I just have to memorize which way the on button is.
Okay. Okay, so Web Design Bootcamp. Everything you need to know before you begin building websites. Why did I not catch that typo? Must have been tired. That's pretty easy, isn't it? For those of you reading the
things you need to know is proofread.
For those of you who are building websites. Okay, so 10 years ago, I thought I just need to learn a little Photoshop and HTML and I can get a job building web pages, which I did towards the very end of the dot-com boom. That was really useful for me to get a high-paying job for 6 months and then I was unemployed. Looking back now, I think that this is a popular misconception. While these two pieces of the puzzle are very important, yes, everyone has to know Photoshop. Yes, everyone needs to at least have an understanding of HTML. There is so much more that goes into building web pages than just these two components. Which is why my last class, which was PSD to HTML, in a sense, this class we're going to go HTML to PSD. But let's talk about all the things that belong in the middle, all the other considerations you need to take into account for before you even begin designing a web page. What a lot of designers do, so the big problem is people with a design background, particularly people with a print background, think, oh, I can do anything in print. I can make a web page, which more often than not looks like a printed page and follows the conventions in print. Or perhaps they're a Photoshop wizard and they know how to use every glow and filter and effect and eye candy trick. They can make stuff look good, but it doesn't necessarily translate into a great, useful piece on the web. The other problem with a lot of web pages is people come from a coding background and they say, oh, I'm a web developer. I know HTML. I can build anything I want, and they frequently look like it was built by an engineer. Or the finished web page ends up looking like an Excel spreadsheet. Let's talk about everything that needs to happen between those two worlds. So I've got a list of about half a dozen different buzzwords which are essential. I can't go into depth enough on these, but these are things that you need to consider, and probably the most important is usability. Usability and accessibility, the two abilities in web design. We need to make pages that are first and foremost usable, and then another constraint is we need to make pages which are accessible. We also need to think about search engine optimization, or SEO, because everyone who wants a website now wants their page to be found, and there are certain best practices that we can take while building our pages which will make them at least more searchable. We also need to understand the limitations and challenges faced by different browsers and different devices. The great challenge in web design, of course, is that your page never really looks the same in every browser, and you need to know how to approach your workflow to, if not prevent that, to meet that challenge. You're also going to need to understand what web standards are. Theoretically, we have a series of standards which we follow, which will help us all get along better. They're not quite there yet. They're still in their infancy, but they're a good idea. It just hasn't reached maturity yet. And probably the most important thing that you can possibly learn is the separation of presentation and content. Because if you're going to make usable, accessible, searchable pages that work on a variety of browsers and devices and follow standards compliance, they're going to need to understand the separation of presentation and content. So briefly, let's talk about usability first. So a lot of people say, oh, I want my web page to be user-friendly, and then you're talking with the new client, you go, tell me more. And they say, like this one, I really like this color blue. And user-friendly does not mean a nice color scheme. People frequently mistake that, and they say, they use the term user-friendly, meaning a site that I like, because it'll be really friendly to the user. User-friendly should really mean highly usable. So there are many disciplines as a subset of usability which you need to focus on, and you're going to hear me use a number of different acronyms, one of which is UI. That's user interface design. Now the term usability and UI originally comes from software design. So 30 years ago, people first started going to what we called a GUI, or GUI, a graphical user interface. The original Macintosh system, and then followed by the Windows system, they had to build user interfaces. So in the beginning of the software and for desktop computers, we had to make software which was usable. Why was the Mac operating system so popular in the beginning? Because it was highly usable. But that still applies to website design as well. Even if it's just a 5-page brochure site, it still has a user interface, and we need to focus on the needs of user interface design. A broader context, I'm going to use the words UX, or user experience design. As more and more of us use the web for accessing our data for entertainment and other things, as we use it over a variety of different devices, and we use more and more apps, as more and more of our experience happens online, the web designer is not just someone who does something in Photoshop, he is designing an experience. He's designing what someone is going to be doing on the other end. In a sense, user experience design is enabling behaviors, making behaviors possible for the person on the other end. It's not just making something look pretty in Photoshop, it's allowing them to accomplish a goal, to complete a task. And pulling the lens back even further, what we're really talking about here is user-centered design, that always keeping the end user in mind. And there's many, this can go way beyond the scope of web pages. This can be talking about how we use the remote control on our TV. This can be talking about the new developments in gaming. This can be talking about kiosks. This can be talking about retail environments. Has anyone checked into a kiosk in an airport lately? Was that a positive or a negative experience? I checked in on Frontier Airlines on my vacation. I was running late. It took 3 minutes. Click, click, click. I was done with my boarding passes. That was user experience design and user-centered design. Clearly, the designers behind that were thinking about people being able to accomplish this task easily. But however we choose to look at it, all three of these disciplines always focus on designing with the end user in mind. I wish I could go back in time in my web design education, and I wish I started doing this 8 or 10 years ago. Because now that I understand how important usability is in terms of website design and how I completely ignored it and overlooked it for years, I wish I could go back and do it differently. And I was speaking with a recruiter this morning about altering my curriculum at Seattle Central Community College, where I teach, and 2 of my students are here in our live audience today. He said that if you understand usability and UI, UX, UCD, it's the difference between a $35 an hour job and a $90 an hour job. So you two, who are here on day 1 of my whole new vision, are off to a running start. 3 of you, yes. Well, he's a first year, so you guys are going to be working for him, actually, because by the time he gets to my second year classes, he's going to be a rock star. So when we talk about usability, understand who your users are. Understand what their demographic is. Do some research. Actually talk to your users, or if not, get some analytic data. Too often, designers start building a website with what the designer wants and not understanding who their users are. If your company already has the company that you're going to be building a website for, if they already have an existing website, install an analytics tool like Google Analytics so we can find out something about their users. If there's not an existing website, ask them to give you some demographic data. Are their users sophisticated? Do they have a high-speed connection? Are they over 60? Do they know how to use the computer? There are so many different constraints and limitations on what constitutes a successful website. If you understand who your end users are, you can build for them. Also knowing what their browser is. You can get all sorts of data. It's all out there. What sort of monitor resolution they have, what sort of bandwidth they have, how are they accessing your site. In the near future, they're going to be accessing on a greater and greater variety of devices. So the challenges that face the web designer are always expanding. And then remember that this is not page layout. While grids are important, while typography is important, while white space is important, we are not designing a static page. We are designing a system. A system, whether it's a page, an experience, or an application, we're designing something which enables the user to do something which makes behaviors possible and helps them accomplish their goal. And I can't emphasize this enough. Whatever you do, from day 1, start thinking about designing with the end user in mind. So before I became a web designer, I was a chef. And when I worked as a chef, as most chefs like to do, we like to go for really dramatic presentation. In kitchens, we'd always say, go for height, try to make it tall and make it as fancy as possible and stack the food on top of the vegetable and put the garnish on top. And then we'd tell the waiters, be careful, don't knock it over as they walked it to the table. And they'd say, you guys you think you're so great, but I put that out on the table and the customer just knocks it over with his fork so he can eat it. What I understand now that I understand then is that really tall food does not understand the user. So if you come from any kind of artistic background, if you're designing with your vision, you either need to change that behavior or you don't belong in web design. Because if you want to do it your way, you're not going to be a successful web designer. And I swear to you, I made this mistake well into my design career. For years, I did not understand usability as a first and foremost practice. And from day 1, for you guys in 4 weeks from yesterday, we're going to be talking about usability. So here's where things go wrong in the design challenge, where there's 2 main problems in designing a web page. One problem is the designer, and the other problem is the client. If we could just eliminate those two obstacles, you could probably have a very successful web page. So what usually happens is the designer and the client meet, and they hit it off really well. They say, oh, wow, you're really great. This is a really good fit. I really like you. Let's build a web page. And they talk and they write a creative brief, and they both agree that what they want is sleek and modern. The designer, of course, thinks sleek and modern. I'm going to use cars as an analogy here. The designer says, let's make it sleek and modern, and I think he said hybrid too, so I'm thinking Toyota Prius, sleek and modern. The client, of course, what does he want? He wants a little more bling than that. The client wants to increase sales, so he's thinking, we've had the same conversation, we've written the same words. He's thinking Cadillac Escalade. And you know, while I was doing this presentation, while I was getting some photos, do you know there's a hybrid Cadillac Escalade? It's only $73,000. So at this point, the designer and the client are both saying, like, we're going to build a website. They think they're on the same page. And if only they'd bothered to do some user research before, if they tried to figure out what the user needs, all the user wants is a Honda Fit. He wants something easy, small, that's convenient to get around in. What ends up happening as the client starts going, well, kinda, but I want it more like this. And the designer goes on revision 8 or revision 12 or revision 15, is this what you want? And what they end up getting is the Nissan Cube, which is some horrible hybrid of the Cadillac Escalade and the Toyota Prius, and looks nothing like what the user needs. So what I would encourage people to do is don't start designing anything until you understand what your users really need. Once you've determined that your page is usable, or that you're designing with the end user in mind, you're going to be faced with a series of constraints called accessibility. You need to make your pages accessible. Now, a lot of people mean, you mean I have to be able to understand them? Well, not exactly. What accessibility means, the great promise of the web, and the web is almost 20 years old now, was that it was going to be accessible to the greatest number of potential users. The whole idea behind the worldwide part of the www is, if I make a web page, everyone in the world should be able to see it. It should be completely democratic. It was supposed to be the great unifier. And if you've been following what's been happening in the news between Verizon and Google, they are trying to make the World Wide Web not quite so worldwide. So what does that mean for your role as a designer? Well, you need to design a page that everyone can see. Well, who is everyone? Bullet points are in the wrong order. It's not just a good idea, it's the law. In the United States here, if you work for a governmental agency, you're going to have to follow something called Section 508 compliance, which makes sure that your web page is accessible to everyone. Who is this everyone we're talking about? Well, a big part of it is for people who are visually impaired. In a sense, we need to make our pages accessible to everyone with disabilities, and a certain percentage of the population, at my last research, 3%, use some sort of screen reading software to view your web pages. Now, you and I probably don't think that's a big deal because we don't have to face these constraints, but if you are actually navigating with your keyboard and hearing what the web page, hearing the content of the web page, you're going to have a much worse experience if your page is not accessible, and a much better experience if your page is accessible. So while not all of you are going to work for King County and be required to make accessible pages, if you want to strengthen your chops as a web designer, if you want to adhere to the highest standards, and if you want to, well, it will limit if you can't do it, you're not going to be able to get a job sooner or later. If you want to get hired, you need to start thinking about making your pages accessible from day one, meaning before you even open up Photoshop. What does this mean? In its simplest, there's a certain number of rules, which I'll get into in greater detail. At its very simplest, it means including alt tags, and at its greatest, it means going to great lengths to make your page more accessible. But the way that you build your page, if you understand the separation of presentation and content, will make a big difference and go a great length in making your pages accessible. And you're thinking, wait, I'm a visual designer. You're telling me I have to design web pages for blind people? Well, that's the bad rap that it normally gets. You're not designing web pages for blind people. You're making your pages accessible to the greatest number of people possible. Now, this might not be a big deal if you think building a ski and snowboard school. How many blind skiers are there out there? How could that possibly be important? one thing to remember is not only does it make you a good citizen and a better designer, but it's going to improve search engine optimization, because the biggest blind reader out there is Google, or all these search engines are blind in a sense. And if you make your pages accessible, they will be viewed by search engines better, and you will get, or your client will get, better search rankings. So SEO, everybody wants it. Everybody's heard this term by now, search engine optimization. Your clients are going to tell you two things. I want you to build me a website, and I want to be first on Google. One of my clients recently Googled herself and wanted to know why her website didn't come up first. It's like, I have only so much control over this. While we need to be mindful of SEO before we start building pages, we're not magicians. We can't do everything. And the clients will frequently say, is $500 enough? For both the website and the SEO. The SEO people that I talk to say, if you really want to be first in Google, you need to spend money on a recurrent basis every month. You need to allow a budget of like $500 a month for SEO if you really want to make a difference. So just me making the website isn't going to be enough. You need to understand that web design and SEO are separate skills with separate budgets, like advertising and public relations. So while you can offer them some SEO benefit, you probably aren't going to offer them an SEO miracle. However, if we code our pages properly, if we follow web standards, if we follow accessibility guidelines, if we stick to the separation of presentation and content, we will get better rankings in the search results. This is what we call organic search, and it's done by following best practices, which is what I'll be describing in the course of this class. Accessible pages get better search results, and pages which are not accessible get penalized by Google. So the more accessibility rules that you break, if you don't follow web standards, your page is going to go down in its rankings. So it's a good practice to get into from day one. What are web standards? Well, we'll get to that in a moment, but you can read more about them at w3c.org or webstandards.org. So the great thing about web standards is there aren't any. Or while there's lots of great standards, but not everyone is following them. So ideally, web standards are based on the browser makers, the software makers, the hardware makers, Dell, HP, Apple, Google, Microsoft. Everyone agrees that we're going to follow these web standards. That means that if I write my web page in a certain way, following standards compliant code, the browser promises to display it in a certain way. Theoretically, all the browsers and the hardware manufacturers follow web standards, and our web pages all look identical in every browsers. Unfortunately, that isn't the case. There's a small company in Redmond who makes a browser, which is now 10 years old, called IE6, which does not render pages in a standard compliant way. And what's happening in 2 weeks? Anybody know? September 15th? IE9, that's right. That will hopefully be the last nail in the coffin for IE6. Perhaps we can stop developing for IE6, but right now, we still need to. So the problem with web standards, meaning there aren't any, is that IE6 is not a standards compliant browser. IE7 is a little better. IE8's really good standards compliant browser. IE9 is supposed to be fantastic, almost caught up with the other ones. But the burden on you as a web designer is you need to follow web standards even if somebody else doesn't. So a better way to look at this is standards compliant pages can be seen on more screens. You're never going to get standard browser compliance across every browser. Web pages look a little different in Firefox, in Safari, in Internet Explorer, in Opera. Make sure that you tell your clients there's going to be some differences, because I can't get it pixel perfect. It's going to take way too many hours to get it pixel perfect on a browser. Just say that I'm writing standards compliant code so that I can get you a broader exposure, the best exposure I can get, by writing standards compliant HTML and CSS. So by now, a lot of you are probably thinking your heads are spinning. It's like, how can I possibly remember all this stuff and write standards compliant HTML and CSS? Well, the good news is Dreamweaver takes care of most of this for you. David, you had someone ask earlier today, do they need to have Dreamweaver? You don't need to have Dreamweaver. You can use some other tool, but I've been working in the industry for 10 years. I think it's the best tool out there. It's the industry standard tool. If you've got Dreamweaver CS3, CS4, CS5, They're all great. If you want to download the free trial version of Dreamweaver at the Adobe website, you can do that. But I really stand behind the product. Dreamweaver makes it super easy to write standards compliant code without really needing to know a lot about code. And then I'll show you later how to use an online validator to check for errors to see if your code really is standards compliant. If you've been surfing the web, you might have seen these little badges right here in the top right corner of my screen. That means it's certified HTML and certified CSS. What I wrote or what I will write today for today's class is standards compliant. We should always strive to get this on all of our pages, because then we know we're following best practices. So CSS and HTML, they're joined at the hip. You can't have one without the other. So in the beginning, 10 years ago, I thought, oh, I've got to learn HTML. And I didn't know how to type at the time, so I was, one finger typing, HTML, close tag. And I was making pages with tables, and I slavishly learned every HTML tag out there. If you're just getting started in web design right now, don't do that. Don't learn a lot of HTML. Understand how HTML works, learn how to recognize the code, but don't spend a lot of time learning HTML. It's not really going to be a really good use of your time. If you're going to learn one thing in this next 4 weeks, other than usability, if you're going to learn two things, usability and CSS, cascading style sheets, because if you really want to build web pages and you want them to look great and you want to be effective, CSS is going to be the way to do that. And here's where we're talking about the separation of presentation and content. And I think this is a hard thing to grasp for a lot of beginners, so I'm going to go over it at a granular level. Content is machine readable. This is what the browser reads. This is what Google reads. This is the HTML document. Presentation is human viewable. This is how we use CSS to change the appearance of the HTML. So HTML hypertext markup language, CSS cascading style sheets. The HTML is naked, raw, unstyled HTML code. It's a markup language. It just basically says, this is a heading, this is a paragraph, this is a link, this is an image. CSS is a presentation language which says, take that heading, take that paragraph, and make them have a certain appearance. This is what your HTML looks like. So you can see your basic HTML document always has an opening HTML tag, and when I say tag, I mean the thing that's wrapped by the little opening and closing brackets. So that's open HTML, open head, the title tag, close head, open body, an H1 tag, a paragraph tag, close body, and close HTML. Closing tags always have a slash before them. Opening tags don't. This is HTML at its simplest. This is about as much HTML as you need to know. You need to know what it looks like. You need to know how it's formed. You need to be able to find an error if it exists, but you don't need to memorize a whole lot more about this, and you don't need to type this out by hand, because Dreamweaver is going to do most of that for you. If you're really going to learn to read something arcane or foreign, it needs to be CSS. Now what this is saying is, this is the H1 tag, and what you see between the opening and closing little brackets is, I want it styled a certain way. I want it to have a Tahoma for the font, and I want it to be a certain color. And all my paragraphs, I want Georgia for the font, and I want them to be a certain color. And that's written in hexadecimal color right now. What the CSS is doing to the HTML is saying, take this and turn it into this. So the CSS is the presentation, the HTML is the content. Let's just skip this whole slide on browsers, devices, and operating systems and go straight to what are we going to build. So we're going to look at a fictional client here who needs a redesign of their website. We're going to get some demographic data. We're going to do some user research. We're going to, even though I'm just going to make this data up, we'll pretend that I got it for real. And then I'm going to develop some personas, some fictional, hypothetical users. So the great thing about personas, it's trying to imagine who is going to be using your website and then building a website for them. How many personas should you use? The usual number is 3 or 5 or 7. More than that and it gets too complicated. Less than that it becomes ineffective. So what we will do is we're going to use Jim. as a persona. Jim is 40-something, has 15 years as a designer, is affluent. No, Jim is moderately affluent, but not impoverished, but not driving a Cadillac Escalade. Jim is middle class, let's say. Jim is 40-something, middle class, and web savvy. And so Jim has this much understanding about the website I'm going to build. Don is 40-something, right, Don? And fairly unsophisticated as a web user. Still uses Internet Explorer as his browser. Yeah. So here I have two different personas. They are similar age. They're both Caucasian males sitting in front of me. They both have a little gray stubble on their chins, but vastly different skill sets. You're a power user on the internet. You upload videos to Vimeo. You're a very sophisticated web user. You're a less sophisticated web user. Is that safe to say?
Not really.
Okay. For the sake of my argument,
Yes.
we'll admit that I'm wrong, but I have two personas here. And Cynthia is how sophisticated in her web skills?
Pretty low.
Pretty low. So I've got three different personas. In a sense, I would flesh these out in my writing and write a paragraph about them. I get their demographic data, their age, their gender, their income level. I would try to imagine what their skills are and say, how are they going to use my website that I'm designing? And if I make something too complicated, I'm going to lose you. Is that safe to say? And if I make something too basic or simple or boring, I'm going to lose you. Is that right?
Potentially.
Potentially. So inevitably, as you develop personas for your website, they should be at odds with each other somewhere because different users are going to have different needs. Try to imagine the conflicts that are going to arise by trying to meet the needs of different users. Imagine what their goals are, imagine how they're going to try to use the site, and try to come up with a system which meets a common ground for all the needs of the users. Then ask the client what needs to happen on the site. What I've done for years, and I think I did this too soon, is I'd go to the client and say, what do you want it to look like? And then the client says, we want it to look like that, and then you do the facepalm thing and say, oh God, I need the money. Instead, try to determine what the user's needs are first, then determine what the client's needs are. What is the functionality? What needs to be accomplished? And I'm going to invert my triangle here, and this is really how I'm thinking about web design now. At the peak of the pyramid is the user, and what we're doing is enabling behaviors. Of secondary priority is the client. He wants to solve a business problem. And now here I am. This used to be first in my needs, and it's now third. What the designer wants. The designer now needs to create a visual solution, but really based on numbers 1 and 2, we're creating a functional solution underneath the surface of a visual solution. So understand the needs of the user, understand the needs of the client, and your real skill as a designer is solving these two problems simultaneously. And we're not even talking about Photoshop yet. We're talking about thinking. We're talking about critical thinking skills. How can I solve these problems before I even open up Photoshop? So let's take a look at Cascade Ski School, our client right here. They have an existing website, which you can see is not terribly sophisticated. And of course, if they are a website owner and they're hiring you, what do they want to do? They want to increase sales. How much is this going to cost? How can you possibly justify the ROI for what it's going to cost? It costs $5,000 for a website, right? What is it? There's nothing there. There's nothing but pixels and code. How can I charge so much? What am I going to do? Well, if I can talk about some sort of conversion factor, if I can talk about more people signing up for ski lessons, if I can make a site which is usable, which is attractive, which is well branded, which is trustworthy, and I can get it better rankings in Google, if more people see the site and if more people sign up for lessons, I've actually given them some tangible ROI. Do you all feel confident enough to promise that you can do all those things? Well, maybe not yet, but that's what we should be moving towards. So before I even start looking at what I think needs a new visual design, let's talk about their users and their needs. Is anybody going to sign up for ski lessons this winter? Well, I'm going to sign up for ski lessons. We're actually going back to Cascade Ski School because that's where my daughter gets her ski lessons. But if I were a new parent wanting to get ski lessons, what would be my primary concerns? Going to the website, I want data, I want to know about safety, I want to know about reliability, and I want to know about value. Why am I going to pick one ski school over another? I'm talking about dropping $300 here, right? I want to know my kid's not going to die. And I want to know that she's going to learn how to ski. And I want to get information about like road conditions and weather conditions. And so data, safety, reliability, and value. Then I'm going to, well, now that I understand the needs of the users, and also keep in mind, I am condensing this for simplicity's sake. We could, of course, go into much greater detail. But let's just look at the competitors' websites. Well, there's one. There's another. These are 4 different Seattle area ski schools. And I would make the assessment that none of them are fairly contemporary nor sophisticated. So in order for Cascade to be better than that, how high do we need to raise the bar? Not that much. So if you took my PSD to HTML class last spring, you saw that I did this, which was a design-driven solution because it was a PSD to HTML class. Does the Cascade Ski School need to look like that? I mean, that's what, a 10-fold increase? So perhaps it needs to be simpler than that. But what I'm going to say to you, and this is the radical approach that I'm taking to this class, is don't do this. Don't do what I did last spring. Don't make a designer-driven solution. Make a user-driven solution. And the big rule of thumb that I like to say if you're going to get into web design is don't design anything that you can't code, or understand what you can code before you begin designing. For those of you who are beginners, you're going to say that's, of course, not realistic yet, but in a sense, we're working backwards. We're going to reverse engineer this. So I've made up some demographic data for Cascade Ski School. I didn't actually have the real data, but I think it's reasonable and understandable. We're going to say 40% are between the ages of 40 and 60, 40% are between the ages of 20 and 40, and 20% of them are young. 65% of them are women and 35% of them are men. 70% are affluent because skiing is an expensive sport. 30% are probably more value conscious and perhaps they just want to buy the lessons for their kids, but they're on a budget. 60% live in the urban Seattle area. 40% live in the suburbs or a rural area. 80% have a broadband connection and 20% are still on dial-up. Seems completely reasonable, right? I made these up, but this could be any business that's trying to, or any public, any demographic public for a business in the Seattle area is facing something like this. You could change your numbers around, but we'd still be faced with a series of challenges. And then here, and 20% still use Internet Explorer 6. I decided to make this hard for myself. Even though IE 6 will be going away soon, let's assume that we've got some data that says we need to meet that demographic. And now look at the user's needs. I want to know where, when, what. Snow conditions, technical details quickly. I just want to get the information from the website. I probably have to go there 3 times before lessons start. I just need information. I also want to know that it's reliable. Is the school legitimate? Are the instructors qualified? How do I know? Based on a website, what if they're fly-by-night? And is it a good value? Skiing is expensive enough already. Is this a trustworthy brand? In a sense, this is where visual design can help you along. You can, and branding certainly helps. And then, I want this on my phone. How many times are you driving to the mountain and you think, God, I wish I knew something. Can I just get this on my phone? So, particularly for the 20% that are between the ages of 12 and 20, they certainly are going to want to be able to get this information on their phones. So, what are we going to need to build? We need a website which looks sophisticated and contemporary for our affluent urban professionals, but it needs to load quickly over slow connections and display correctly in older browsers. In a sense, because we've looked at possible personas, these two things are kind of at odds with each other, and I need to find a middle ground which is meeting the needs of all of my users, and it needs to work on mobile devices for my younger, mobile-driven users. So let's go back just a moment to their existing site. We'll just go out of here in the browser. Let's go to the existing site here to get a closer look at it. There we go. So you can see there's a lot of links here on the side, and there's a rule of thumb for usability is no more than 7 links, because in terms of human memory, we can't really grasp any more than 7 ideas at one time. Your site might, that doesn't mean you can't have 8, but this doesn't fit in my scrollable window, and 2, it's probably too many links. Whenever possible, try to simplify. Obviously, some sites need 100 links on the front page. It doesn't apply for everything, but when in doubt, try to simplify the number of links on the page, and try not to, if your nav bar is so big that it needs to be in its own scrolling frame, you probably have done something wrong. They've done a couple of things right here. Having the phone number in the top right corner, statistically, according to usability tests, is great because a lot of people just want the phone number. A good quote here. Generally, my opinion on scrolling text on the marquee tag is that's out of date. I wouldn't encourage that. This message from the founders is good, but it's kind of small down here. This is important. I can see that it belongs to the Professional Ski Instructors of America. That gives me a sense of reliability. So we've got a lot of good data here. It's not presented in the best way, but clearly it's got a lot of the functionality that it needs. We just need to sort of refine the solution. The first thing that I would do is come up with a new sitemap. And I would say, can we simplify that to a smaller number of links? And instead of, you notice they had classes at 4 different places on the mountain. I just simplified that to classes, schedules, instructors, locations, gear, transportation, and contact. Now, some of you might have clearly there are other ways that we could do this. In a sense, I've done a Deus machina, and that means God in the machine, and I've just decided arbitrarily that this is what the users wanted. Clearly, you could look at that user data and you could come up with a slightly different solution. It would probably be just as good as mine, but we're going to stick with this for now. So I've simplified the navigation, and if I got sign-off on this from my client, and I said, does this work? Is this accurate? Can we reduce the number of pages? Can we simplify your site? Let's say they say yes. The next thing I would do is I would wireframe it. So wireframing is sometimes a misunderstood concept in web design, and it's not just a rough sketch. It's not just a thumbnail. What we're trying to say here is these are the neighborhoods or regions of the page, the main areas of content that I want that I think are going to enable user behavior. So let's just assume that another typo, customer quotes, not with an O. Customer quotes are really great in websites right now in terms of fostering reliability. If people see that there were satisfied customers, it's very convincing. I would say the Pro Ski Instructors Association, that needs to move up from the bottom of the page. What? Nothing?
I don't see a typo.
Oh. Isn't it custom? Isn't it UM?
No.
Oh, that's correct? Just looks odd to me.
Yeah, that's correct. Somebody did point out site being the wrong version
Yeah.
before.
There we go. So I would say the highest priority, their mission statement, the Pro Ski Instructors Association, and customer quotes, moving the navigation up and from the right, having contact info, the logo, and the footer. So in a sense, what the agreement that you're trying to make right here is these are the regions or neighborhoods that I need on this page. And can we find what can we find what we're looking for? Can the user find what they're looking for? Can I start building in this direction before I even open up Photoshop? So you might go through 2 or 3 or 4 rounds of wireframing before getting agreement. I'm only going to go through 1. And then I'm going to make a new HTML document. So I'm not even thinking about Photoshop. What I'm encouraging people to do is the big challenge, a lot of visual designers have to work with the developer at some point. And a lot of visual designers mock it up in Photoshop, and then someone slices it up and codes it for them. And that frequently creates a lot of friction because the developers don't like doing what the designers, trying to implement what the designers created, and designers are sometimes frustrated that the developer didn't build it right according to their original spec. Best solution, of course, is only design what you can code and only code what you can design, but sometimes you're going to work with someone. This is to help the beginners out there understand what the developer is going through. before you even open up Photoshop. So understanding how it's built first, and then we'll add a visual skin to it. So in a sense, here is our unstyled HTML document. This is what it looks like in Dreamweaver. You wouldn't need to know a whole lot of HTML to do this. All you would have to do is type and then modify it with a few tags. This is what the HTML looks like underneath the skin. As you can see that there are H1 tags. There's something called a UL tag, which is an unordered list. There's a couple of H2 tags, some paragraph tags. So you can see my markup is fairly simple. And before we go any further, you need to understand the CSS box model. All of those elements which we just looked at, every HTML element, a paragraph, an H1 tag, everyone's a box. In this case, I'm looking at a paragraph tag, and you can see in HTML that it has an opening and closing P tag. And I've drawn a red line around it. That doesn't mean it has a red line, that's just so you can see what I'm talking about. Now let's write some CSS for that box. There's my paragraph tag. Every box has padding, or has the potential to have padding. You can put padding on one side, two sides, or all four sides. Padding makes the box bigger, and you can see in my CSS that I've written that my paragraph now has 5 pixels of padding. Well, my box has gotten bigger by 5 pixels on every side. Every box can have a border. That border can once again be specified to be on 1, 2, 3, or 4 sides. Border begins where the padding ends. So you can see I've now written some CSS that says a 3-pixel border with a purple color. Every box has a margin. The margin begins where the border ends. The margin pushes outside the box. It's also sometimes called the force field, because we can use it to push around other elements on the page. Every box can have a background image. Background image is equal to the size of the padding, so if I needed more of my image to show, if perhaps some of it were clipped, I would need to add more padding. Every box can have a background color, but the background color was always behind the background image. Now, a lot of people sort of confuse these two. A good way to remember it is the difference between margin and padding. Margin pushes away from the box. Padding makes the box bigger. Even though the net effect might look the same, they are subtly different things that are happening there. So I'm now going to take that unstyled document and I'm going to make it look like this using a little margin and padding and something called floats. And what I'm going to encourage people to do is don't even start your visual design until you understand how this is put together. You're finally seeing my quotes?
Yes. I've never skied in my life. There's a ski quote from me.
Okay, so I'm going to go into Dreamweaver now, Dreamweaver CS5, and I've put together some files for the people who have purchased the course. And let me show you how easy this is to do. Let me just delete this for a minute and write Cascade Ski School.
You've got Cascade
Skin School.
Which might be very interesting.
Yeah. And I'm going to unformat this right now. It's still a H1 tag instead of formatting. So all you really need to do is type. Most of you can probably type better than me, as you can see. If I select some type on my page and I go to my Properties Inspector, if you don't have that open, it's Window, Properties. And right here, there's 2 tabs, HTML and CSS. With the HTML tab selected, I'm just going to say format that as an H1 tag. H1 tags are really important for search engine optimization. HTML tags H1 tags are a part of semantic markup. Using H1 tags is a part of using web standards. If I look into my code view here, you can see that it says H1 end H1 Cascade Ski School. Is there a question there, David?
Yeah, question from the chat room. What did you uncheck when you went in there?
What did I uncheck?
Yes.
Well, I deleted this and I retyped it.
Okay.
And then I unformatted it. I took its formatting to none, and then I reformatted it as an H1 tag.
I think that's what they were looking for.
So all I've really done is type, and actually I didn't even type. All I did was copy and paste a lot of code into this, and I made sure that my tags were in the right place, opening H1, close H1. I made something called an unordered list here, which might seem a little odd, but lists are really important for navigation. So if you have a navigation on your site, it should be an unordered list. I have H2 tags, which are very important for search engine optimization, and I have paragraph tags. So you can see there's not a whole lot of HTML happening here. There's some list items and there's some A tags, but there's really only 4 or 5 different types of HTML. I didn't type any of this. Dreamweaver wrote it for me. What I encourage people to do as in their development is get this far and make sure that you have valid HTML before you go any further. How do I know it's valid? I'm going to return to my browser. I'm going to find my first draft here. Now I have something called the Web Dev Toolbar installed. This is a plugin for Firefox. It's also available for Chrome if you use Chrome. You can get it at chrispetterick.com. I'll show you the link later, but if I go to Tools and I say Validate HTML, it goes to the W3C validator and it says that I successfully checked as XHTML 1.0 transitional. I have no errors. It's a lot better to find errors early in your process rather than late in your process. What is this XHTML 1.0 transitional? Let's return to my document here and go into Code View. You see up here at the top, I want all of you at home to memorize this and learn how to type it with your eyes closed. No, don't actually do that. This Dreamweaver does it for you. Watch what happens when I say File New, Command N. When I make a new document, I select XHTML 1.0 transitional. What is this? What is a doc type? A doc type is basically an agreement between the web page and the browser that says, I agree to write this code in a certain format if you agree to render it in a certain format. There are many different doc types. If you have any doubt, XHTML 1.0 transitional. For anyone who's just a beginner, make sure you use this doc type. If you know what a strict doc type is, if you know what a mobile doc type is, if you've started using HTML5, you probably shouldn't be taking this course. So for everyone else, XHTML 1.0 transitional, when I hit create, do you see that Dreamweaver has put all this in here for me? The doc type, the namespace, the meta equivalent. The first thing that you're going to want to do is under the title tag, type my web page or Cascade Ski School, whatever you want to do. Title tags are really important. They're not the same as file names, but they are very important for search engine optimization. Notice as soon as I do that and hit refresh, I get a title at the top of my document. One of the surest indicators of an amateur, if you've ever seen this on the web, at the top of your browser bar, if it says Untitled Document, you know that the person doesn't know what they're doing. So now if I were to continue building this Cascade Ski School, the whole way I built that whole page was type, format, H1, and so on. I copied some paragraphs, I put in an unordered list, and I built my page. I'm going to close this one out. Now, how did I get from this to this to this? I used something called divs for layout. So I'm going to get to here right now. Divs are like regions or neighborhoods. While this is all well and good, we don't have a lot of layout control. So divs allow us to use CSS for layout with a principle called floats. In a sense, what I'm doing is I'm wrapping the page or sections of the page in a series of containers and then moving those containers around. The first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to make an outermost div to hold everything, which I'm going to call container. You can call it container, you can call it wrapper, you can call it whatever you want, but container and wrapper are the most standard in terms of web conventions. And also keep in mind that someone's going to be working on your code after you're done with it. Someone's going to update this website, so think about the next person after you. I'm going to go into Code View. from my opening body tag right after that to just before my closing body tag, I'm going to select all that code. So this is everything that's visible on the page. And I'm going to say Insert, Layout Object, Div Tag. I get a new CSS rule dialog box. Excuse me, I'm going to first select, I'm going to give it an ID. And I'll talk about IDs in just a minute. And I'm going to say New CSS Rule, call it Container. I'm going to go to, in this dialog box, I'm going to give it a width of 960 pixels, and I'm sure my background colors won't match, but I'll try to get as close as I can. I'm going to give it an ugly color, an ugly background color. Why am I going to do this? Because this is the way web developers work. Why would I give it an ugly color? To remind me that I need to change it later. This is only temporary. I'm going to click OK, return to Design View, and you can see that everything is now contained in one box. If I preview this in the browser, looks like that. I now have a little more control over my layout. Returning to Dreamweaver, I'm now going to grab the H1 tag from opening to closing H1 tag, and I'm going to say Insert, Layout Object, Div Tag. I'm going to call it Header. Make a new CSS rule, and I'll just give it a height of 200 and a background color of light blue, and click OK. And you see that my page is starting to take some form. I'm going to return to code view. Do you see this unordered list from UL to closing UL? Perhaps I should talk about the easy way to write that, since you can't possibly remember UL and LI. Create a new document. Watch what happens if I go like this. If I can just grab that page, well, we'll just write Don. I'm going to select the first word in my list, and I'm going to say Format, List, Unordered List. And you see that Don has a bullet point. I'm going to write Jim. Every time I hit return, a new bullet point is generated. Cynthia and Matt. Look at what's been done in code view. UL, LI, let's make that a little more readable. Each one of these is a list item, and they're contained in a list. Unordered list stands for the list. LI stands for the list item. A lot of people would think it's the other way around because they think phonetics. LI must be the list, but LI is the list item. There's many of them. UL is the unordered list. There's one of them, or one for each navigation. All your navigation needs to be an unordered list, because in terms of semantic markup, in terms of web standards, in terms of what the browser understands, for search engine optimization, a list is merely a list of the pages in the site, and it's considered best practices. I know that doesn't look like a nav bar yet, but it will be. How did I turn these into links? By selecting that type, going to my property inspector, going into the link field, I'm just going to put in a £sign now as a placeholder link, but I could also write about.html, and I can turn all of these into links. And now if I go back into code view, you can see that each one also has an A tag. So the A tag is the link. That lives inside the list item, which lives inside the unordered list. Notice I just had Dreamweaver do all of that for me. I didn't type a single line of HTML code. You just need to know how that code works. You don't need to type it by hand. Don't save that. Go back to here. There we go. Get rid of that one. So that's how I got this unordered list. I'm going to wrap this unordered list in another div tag by saying Insert, Layout Object, Div Tag, and call it Nav. New CSS rule. I'll give it a background color of some other color. Now this is the tricky part. I'm going to make it only 50 pixels high. I'm going to click OK and go back into Design View. You see my div, it's orange. You see my list, it's hanging out of there. It looks ugly now. I'll fix that later. Let's go to Mission. Now watch what happens if I try this in Design View. I'm about to say Insert Layout Object Div Tag, but I'm not going to do that because I know it's going to make an error, because going into Code View, see how not everything is selected? Always go into Code View to make sure that everything is selected and say Insert Layout Object Div Tag. Oops, this one's called Mission, right? Because it's our mission statement. New CSS rule. I'll give this a different background color and click OK. And you can see that my page is starting to take shape. I'm now going to go into Code View and find Certified Instructors. Insert Layout Objects Div Tag. Call it Instruct, New CSS Rule. Give it a different background color, and click OK. So I don't think I need to do that over and over again. You sort of get where I'm going with this. In a sense, I'm wrapping sections of the pages in different boxes, and I'm going to jump ahead to layout.html. Here's my finished version of that, but let's quickly go to the CSS cheat sheet, which I have open in Preview. You saw me making these things called IDs. Well, let's back up a sec. There's 4 different ways to define a CSS rule. We can do it to an existing tag, number 1. We can take an existing HTML tag and say style it a certain way, such as the body tag. Let's give it a margin and padding of 0. We can also use something called a class. A class always is preceded by a period, dot class, or in this case, dot red. A class can be used over and over, used multiple times in a web page. So if there were many different places where I wanted the type to turn red, I would make a class called .red and apply that over and over again. A unique ID can only be used once. So these div tags which I just made are all unique IDs or unique identifiers. There's only one container, there's only one header, there's only one nav, and those are preceded by a £sign. A compound selection, in a sense, is also a unique ID in that it is it's always a tag within a tag. So in this case, nav A or #nav A, this is all A tags within a div called nav. So a compound selection is something that's unique to Dreamweaver in terms of its interface, in terms of the options that you can choose. So as you see me defining CSS rules, you'll see me styling tags, using classes, using IDs, and using compound selections. So returning to Dreamweaver, how am I going to get from this to this? So here we really have sort of a 3-column layout. It's starting to take some shape. We're going to use a principle called floats. So the problem with HTML, the hypertext markup language, it was never meant as a layout language. When Tim Berners-Lee developed this 20 years ago, he meant it for scientific documents which just went from top to bottom, headers and paragraphs and hyperlinks. When designers started to get in the games, they said, how can I possibly take some of the content that's at the bottom of the document and move it up and over to create the sort of page layout that a designer would want? In the bad old days, in the dark ages of the 90s and the early 2000s, we used something called tables, but I'd prefer to just forget those days. They had their place, but now we use CSS for floats to move and position this content up and over. Let's do that with our navigation first. So you see my list here. In the bottom of my window, there's something called a breadcrumb trail. Oh God, I forgot I can do this. This is so awesome. I can point to my UL just like that. I'm going to select that UL in my breadcrumb trail. I'm going to go to my CSS styles window, and I'm going to make a new CSS rule. Now this is a compound selection for my nav UL, or the unordered list that lives in this div called nav. I'm going to say OK, and I want this list to have a style type of none. This is called stripping the list, and you'll see me do it over and over again. And I want to strip its margin and padding to 0. Why do I want to do that? Well, different browsers interpret the CSS box model differently, and all of them add a certain amount of padding, about 10 to 15 pixels to the major HTML elements. What Dreamweaver is trying to do is mimic what the browser does and give you extra space. And I'm going to say I want that space stripped away. You're going to see me do this a number of times. I'm going to click OK and watch what happens to my list as I click OK. My bullets are gone and that extra space is gone. I'm now going to grab the word contact and then grab my LI tag in my breadcrumb trail. I'm going to say less specific. Now Dreamweaver is saying, you want me to style the list item inside the unordered list inside this div called nav, which is in fact what I want to do, but I prefer to write a shorthand that says nav li. Nav ULLI, nav li, they're the exact same thing. Which are you more comfortable with? Whichever way helps you memorize the right way to do it. It's the thing within the thing. Go with that. I'm just going to say nav li. I'm going to tell all of my list items, and there are many of them, to display as a block level element. And Sarah, David, if anybody calls in to ask me to explain the difference between block level and inline, I'm just not going to do it. Okay. I'm also going to tell each one of these to have a height of 50, because that's the height of my div called nav. I'm going to give them a width of 137. Now, watch what happens now. They're still sitting on top of each other like a bunch of boxes. When I tell them to float left, they all swing up into a row. So I've been using the principle of floats and telling the items to display as block level elements to all to sit in my div called nav. Now I'm going to take this div called mission I'm going to hit the pencil icon to edit it. I'm going to give it a width of 300 pixels, and I'm going to tell it to float left. Now that was kind of cool, but the problem with floats is they have a gravitational pull on all the other items that follow them. So the other items on the page are kind of being sucked up into the available space. And as you can see by my purple div, it's wrapping around this yellow corner. In order to fix that, I'm now going to go to this div called instructors, the blue one, edit it. I'm going to go to its box level properties. I'm also going to make it 300 pixels and tell it to float left. Matt Sawecki, is that a question? Yeah. We need to hand you the microphone first. We're going to pause just for a moment until Matt gets the microphone, then I'm going to take his question.
I hope it'll reach him.
There you go. You said that it has a gravitational pull on the items that follow it, so
yes.
It wouldn't have any effect on the
items
nav bar above it?
Correct.
Okay.
Excellent question. So for those of you who didn't quite follow that, Matt was saying the items which follow it, which I said yes, and no effect on the items which precede it. So as you can see, I have now floated that column to the left, and they're stacking up nicely, but my other columns, you see I've got a bunch of type superimposed. It's kind of a jumbled mess. Have no fear. I'm now going to go to this div called quotes. I'm going to edit it by clicking on the pencil icon. I will also tell it to float left and give it a width of 300 pixels and click OK. So not bad so far. I've got a little extra space here, but I want these to look like 3 columns. And those of you from the print world, what separates columns? What? Gutters. That's right. I need some gutters between my columns. Understanding our CSS box model, what property do I need to do to create those? Margins. Exactly. Let's learn a little IE6 trick right now. If I put my margin in the same direction of the float, I'm going to get problems in IE6. But what if I go to my yellow div called mission? It's floating left, so let's put a margin on the right. Deselecting same for all. A margin on the right of 30 pixels. And I've got some space here. And now let's go to the div called instructors. Go to box and put a margin on the right of 30 pixels. And look, my 3 columns fit nicely into my 960 pixel grid. But look at my dark blue footer. Because of that float that I've applied to all these things, it's being sucked up to the top of the page. How are we going to get rid of that? A principle called clear. Floats pull things up, and a clear breaks the gravitational pull of the float that preceded it. So I'm going to go to my footer. I'm going to hit the pencil icon to edit it. I'm going to go to its box level properties, and I'm going to say clear. Well, what came before this? Was it a float left or a float right? I can never remember. So as a safety factor, I just say clear both. And I'm going to need to give it a fixed width. Any cleared item needs to have a fixed width to prevent this sort of vortex that it's being sucked up into. And now my footer fits nicely at the bottom of my page. So now I have an H1 tag, which is good for search engine optimization, an unordered list, which is good for best practices, semantic markup, following web standards, SEO. I have H2 tags, and I have paragraph tags. I have a bunch of fairly simple HTML, which you saw in the space of 5 or 10 minutes. I transformed its entire appearance with CSS. Does my code still validate? Well, if you're using Dreamweaver CS4, you have a validator right up here in the top of your toolbar. Now here's the funny thing, I've been using this for years. They eliminated it in Dreamweaver CS5 because they said it was unreliable. And I've been telling people to use it for years. However, I can still use an online validator. I can go to my finished one right here. And in my web dev toolbar, I can say validate HTML. My code still validates. And I can check my CSS. Tools, validate CSS, no errors in my CSS as well. So what I'm hoping people will do before they even go to Photoshop, before they even come up with a visual solution, maybe not memorized by heart, but understand how to build the underlying valid code before you come up with a visual solution. And what I would like, anybody who's following along at home, if they want, they can, here, let's make this just a little smaller so you can see it at home. If you want a challenge, for those of you working at home, I'm going to do Shift-Command-4 on the Mac or print screen on the Windows machine. Take a screenshot of that and open that up in Photoshop. So you know that to meet the needs of the creative brief, it's got to be a 3-column layout. We know it's got to roughly follow these guidelines. File, register later. Go away, Adobe Updater. Try to get me back to Photoshop. File, open. No screenshot on my, oh well, I don't know where the screenshots are going. Anyhow, you understand what I'm trying to do. Take a screenshot, open up in Photoshop, try to build a visual design solution over what you know is a functional, valid HTML and CSS layout. Okay, look at that, 20 after 4 already. Why don't let me go back to Dreamweaver. There's one other thing that I did to get to my final layout here. As you can see, this one, you see this big gap right here at the corner of my page? Remember that default margin and padding that I stripped on the list? See this extra space? Dreamweaver is putting extra space in there to try to mimic what's happening with the browser. Let's get rid of that by doing one more thing. Let's make a new CSS rule for the body tag. Remember, we can write a CSS rule for a tag, and let's set its margin and padding to 0. And watch the top left corner of my screen. It tucks up and now it's flush. Let's do one other thing. Let's go to the container. Let's center this in the page. If I look at this in the browser window now, you can see it's always in the top left corner of the page. How do we center that? Returning to Dreamweaver, let's go to our container. Let's edit that tag, go to the box level properties, deselect same and all for its margin, and give it an auto margin on its left and right side. That means no matter how big your monitor is, even if you've got an Apple 30-inch cinema display, it's always going to be positioned perfectly in the center. Now it's centered. And we enter our bonus round. Wait a minute, I stripped the body tag's margin and padding down to 0. Why is my web page not flush with the top? Tick, tock. First person to grab the mic wins a lifetime supply of free classes at CreativeLIVE.
What?
Am I authorized to do that?
No.
No.
Because your browser is adding that padding,
Adding my two.
adding the margin to the top.
But I stripped my body tag down to 0. What's causing this? Anybody?
Upper and lower margins?
Nope. It's my H1 tag. This big H1 tag needs to have its margin and padding stripped down to 0 as well. Let's go to Dreamweaver and try that. If I grab this, go to my breadcrumb trail, make a new CSS rule that says compound selection header H1, or even just the tag H1 since there's only one of them. If I set its margin and padding to 0 as well, and click OK, preview in Firefox, that's taken away. So these H2 tags, these paragraph tags, this unordered list, this H1 tag, the body tag, they all have an extra margin and padding, which if you're a beginner, it's good to strip them away one by one. And after a while, and this is what we'll look at next week, you'll start using something called a global reset, a CSS style sheet that resets everything all at once. But the reason I do them one by one in the beginning is to show through repetition the intricacy of having to do that on a regular basis. So what I'm going to do next week, now that I know that I have a functional, valid XHTML and CSS document, now that I know this works and I know it meets the needs of the users and meets the needs of the business owner, we've got some agreement, hey, is this going to work? And we do some usability testing and we can find what we're looking for. Next week, I'm going to create a visual solution in Photoshop and apply that to this HTML and CSS.